The morning of April 16th, 1945, 30 nautical miles northwest of Okinawa, Lieutenant Commander Frederick Julian Beckton stood on the bridge of the destroyer USS Laffey, watching his radar screen fill with blips. 50 Japanese aircraft inbound. His ship, positioned at Radar Picket Station No. 1, was the northernmost sentinel, the first warning line for the invasion fleet anchored off Okinawa's beaches. At 8:30 in the morning, a single Aichi D-3A dive bomber appeared, conducting reconnaissance. Laffey's gunners opened fire. The aircraft jettisoned its bomb and fled. Then the real attack began. 4 more D-3As broke formation and dove toward the destroyer. Beckton's crew had trained for this. They knew their weapons. 6 5-inch guns, 12 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft guns, 11 20mm Oerlikon cannons. The Bofors crews swung their weapons skyward, tracking the incoming aircraft. The 40mm guns began firing. 120 rounds per minute per barrel, 4 barrels per mount. The sound was distinctive, a hammering rhythm that rose above the chaos of battle, tracer rounds arcing across the sky in brilliant streams of orange and red. The first Japanese aircraft disintegrated mid-dive, torn apart by the wall of explosive shells. The second followed, then the third. But there were more coming. Many more. What happened in the next 80 minutes would become the most intense kamikaze assault ever recorded against a single ship. 22 aircraft would single out Laffey for attack. 9 would be shot down. 6 would crash into the destroyer. 4 bombs would find their mark. When it was over, 32 American sailors would be dead, 71 wounded, and Laffey would earn a nickname that would echo through naval history: the ship that would not die. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But this story is not really about Laffey. It is about the weapons that defended her, and about the men who flew toward those weapons, knowing they would not return. It is about a collision between industrial production and human desperation, between technological superiority and spiritual conviction. It is about the moment when Japanese pilots, raised to believe in the invincibility of will and sacrifice, discovered that courage could not overcome mathematics, that no amount of devotion could defeat the simple, brutal efficiency of the 40mm Bofors gun firing 160 rounds per minute into the sky above an American carrier task force. The Japanese pilots diving toward American ships in 1945 believed many things. They believed their sacrifice would turn the tide of war. They believed one aircraft, properly aimed, could sink a capital ship. They believed their emperor was divine and their cause was righteous. They believed, because they had been told that American anti-aircraft fire was inaccurate and ineffective. They were wrong about almost everything. But they kept coming anyway, wave after wave, because by the spring of 1945, belief was all Japan had left. The kamikaze tactic emerged from strategic desperation. By October 1944, when Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi formed the first organized suicide units in the Philippines, Japan's situation was catastrophic. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been shattered at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June, where American pilots shot down an estimated 243 of 373 attacking Japanese carrier aircraft in a single day. Naval aviators called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. More devastating than the aircraft losses were the pilots' experienced aviators, whose skills could not be replaced. Japanese pilot training before the war had been rigorous and selective. Naval aviators underwent years of specialized instruction in dedicated schools. When the Pacific War began in December 1941, the average Japanese Navy pilot had 700 hours of flying time. Army pilots averaged 500 hours. These men were among the finest aviators in the world, capable of extraordinary feats of navigation and combat flying. They had proven themselves in China, at Pearl Harbor, across the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies. Their skill was undeniable. But Japan's training system was designed for a short war against limited opposition. It produced high-quality pilots in small numbers. When combat losses mounted first at Coral Sea, then catastrophically at Midway, then through the grinding attrition of the Solomon Islands campaign, the system could not keep pace. Unlike the Americans, who expanded their training programs and accepted slightly lower individual quality in exchange for far greater numbers, Japan simply pushed inadequately trained replacements into combat. By January 1, 1945, the average Japanese Navy pilot graduated with 275 hours of flying time. Army pilots had 130 hours. Some Navy pilots entered combat with as little as 40 hours of flight training. Their American opponents typically had 525 hours or more. The disparity was not merely quantitative. American pilots trained on the aircraft they would fly in combat. They practiced gunnery, navigation, formation, flying, carrier landings. They learned from instructors who had combat experience and could pass on hard-won tactical knowledge. Japanese pilots in late 1944 often received minimal instruction in obsolete aircraft, then were handed modern fighters they had never flown and sent directly into battle. Many died on their first mission, shot down by better-trained Americans in superior aircraft before they could even locate their targets. This was the context in which kamikaze tactics were born. If Japanese pilots could no longer compete in conventional air combat, perhaps they could be effective in suicide attacks. The logic was coldly pragmatic. A mediocre pilot who knew only how to take off and steer could still strike a ship if he aimed his entire aircraft at it. No evasive flying required, no dogfighting skills needed. Just point the nose at a target and maintain course until impact. One pilot, one plane, one ship. The mathematics seemed favorable, especially compared to conventional bombing, which required extensive training and frequently missed entirely. The first organized kamikaze attack occurred on October 25, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. 5 Mitsubishi. A 6M0 fighters, led by Lieutenant Yukio Seki, escorted by ace pilot Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, targeted American escort carriers off Samar. 1-0 crashed into the flight deck of USS Street Low. The resulting fires detonated the bomb magazine, sinking the carrier. It was the first Allied aircraft carrier sunk by kamikaze attack. By day's end, kamikaze pilots had damaged 6 other escort carriers. To Japanese military leadership, the tactic appeared vindicated. One successful hit had accomplished what conventional attacks could not. What they did not fully appreciate was the cost. From October 1944 through the end of the war, Japan flew approximately 2,550 kamikaze missions. Only 475 achieved hits or damaging near misses. The success rate was 18.6%. More than 80% of kamikaze pilots died without striking their targets. They were shot down by American fighters on combat air patrol, destroyed by anti-aircraft fire from screening destroyers, or blown apart by the massed guns of the ships they tried to attack. The pilots themselves were increasingly young and inexperienced. Many were university students conscripted under special wartime laws. Others were teenagers who volunteered out of patriotic fervor or social pressure. They underwent abbreviated training focused on basic flying skills and ideological indoctrination. The emphasis was on spiritual preparation rather than technical competence. Instructors taught them to embrace death as the highest form of service, to view their sacrifice as beautiful and pure, to believe that through their actions the divine wind would protect Japan. The propaganda was relentless. Newspapers published photographs of smiling young pilots in their flight suits, goggles pushed back on their foreheads, white scarves tucked into their jackets. They posed in groups, arms around each other's shoulders, projecting confidence and joy. The articles described them as heroes, modern samurai who would save the nation through their selfless devotion. The reality, hidden from the public, was that many pilots were terrified, that some volunteered only because refusing would bring dishonor to their families, that veteran instructors wept when they sent their students on missions they knew were futile. The military provided ceremonial rituals to reinforce commitment. Before their final flights, pilots drank water from sake cups in formal farewells. They wore 1,000 stitch belts, strips of cloth with 1,000 stitches sewn by 1,000 different women, believed to provide protection in battle. They carried personal items, photographs of family, letters from loved ones, locks of hair from mothers or sisters. Many wrote final letters to be delivered after their deaths, carefully crafted messages expressing devotion to emperor and country while revealing, in subtle ways, their fear and sadness. The aircraft themselves were often barely airworthy. By 1945, Japan's industrial capacity was collapsing under the weight of American submarine interdiction and strategic bombing. Fuel was scarce, replacement parts non-existent. Kamikaze units received whatever aircraft could still fly: obsolete trainers, damaged fighters, bombers so worn that mechanics despaired of keeping them operational. Pilots sometimes took off, knowing their engines might fail before they reached the target area. Some missions were aborted not by American defenses but by mechanical breakdown. Yet despite everything, the inadequate training, the deteriorating aircraft, the horrific casualty rates, the attacks continued. In April 1945, during the Battle of Okinawa, Japan launched Operation Kikusui, a series of massed kamikaze strikes against the American invasion fleet. 10 major attacks over 2.5 months, thousands of sorties. The goal was to inflict such catastrophic losses that the Americans would negotiate a peace short of unconditional surrender. The reality was that kamikaze attacks, while deadly and demoralizing, could not overcome American material superiority. The weapon that would prove decisive in this unequal contest was not American. It was Swedish. The Bofors 40mm automatic cannon, designed in 1932 by the Bofors Arms Manufacturing Company, had become by 1944 the most widely deployed medium anti-aircraft gun in the world. Its development began when Sweden's navy, dissatisfied with their existing anti-aircraft weapons, contracted with Bofors to create something more capable. The result was an automatic cannon that could fire a 2-pound high-explosive shell at a rate of 120 rounds per minute to an effective range of approximately 1,500 yards. The weapon's excellence was immediately recognized. By 1939, Bofors had delivered the guns to 18 countries and concluded production licenses with 11 others. The British Army tested Polish-built Bofors guns in 1937 and quickly adopted them as their standard light anti-aircraft weapon. When war broke out, production expanded dramatically. Commonwealth factories alone manufactured over 19,000 Bofors guns during the war. The United States, after receiving plans from the Royal Navy, began producing the weapon under license in 1941. American factories would ultimately build more than 150,000 units. The gun operated on a relatively simple principle: automatic loading assisted by gravity. Ammunition came in 4-round clips, loaded manually by trained crews. As the gun fired, gravity helped feed the next round into the chamber, while spent casings were ejected downward. The mechanism was reliable, simple to maintain, and devastatingly effective. Each 40mm shell contained enough high explosive to destroy an aircraft with a single hit. The rounds were fitted with tracer elements that allowed gunners to observe their fire and adjust aim in real time. Naval mountings came in two configurations: twin mounts with 2 barrels and quadruple mounts with 4. The USS Laffey carried 12 40mm guns in 3 quadruple mounts and 3 twin mounts. A twin mount could fire 160 rounds per minute, total 80 per barrel. A quad mount delivered 320 rounds per minute, filling the air with explosive shells. The guns could elevate to 90 degrees for high-angle fire or depress to -5 degrees for surface targets. They could traverse 360 degrees, covering all approaches. Power operation on naval mounts meant gunners could track fast-moving targets smoothly and continuously. Each Bofors crew consisted of 7 men: a gun captain who commanded the mount and coordinated fire, a pointer who controlled elevation, a trainer who controlled traverse, 2 first loaders who fed ammunition clips into the left and right barrels, and 2 second loaders who brought ammunition from ready lockers and passed it to the first loaders. Additional ammunition passers could be added during heavy action. The crews trained constantly, practicing loading drills until they could maintain maximum rate of fire even under stress. Speed was essential every second. Without fire was a second. An attacking aircraft had to close the distance. The American Navy deployed Bofors guns throughout the fleet. Every major warship, larger than a small landing craft, carried them. Battleships and carriers had dozens. Cruisers and destroyers bristled with multiple mounts. Even auxiliaries and supply ships received Bofors installations for self-defense. The guns were supplemented by 20mm Oerlikon cannons for close-in defense and 5-inch dual-purpose guns for long-range engagement. This created a layered defense. 5-inch guns engaged aircraft at 6 to 8 miles, Bofors guns took over at 3,000 yards, and Oerlikons provided last-ditch protection inside 1,000 yards. The Navy's satisfaction with the Bofors was demonstrated by an unusual practice: telegraphing Chrysler Corporation, which manufactured the guns under license, with the serial numbers of weapons that had shot down aircraft. This was not merely bureaucratic record-keeping, it was recognition that the weapon worked exactly as designed, that American factories were producing equipment that saved lives and won battles. For sailors manning anti-aircraft stations, knowing their weapons were effective provided psychological reassurance as valuable as the physical protection the guns offered. By the time of the Okinawa campaign in April 1945, American anti-aircraft defenses had evolved into a sophisticated system. Radar could detect incoming aircraft at 75 to 100 nautical miles. Destroyers on picket stations extended this capability to 150 miles. Fighter direction centers aboard carriers vectored combat air patrols to intercept raids well away from the fleet. Most attacking aircraft were destroyed by American fighters long before they reached the ships. Those that survived the fighter screen then faced the massed fire of dozens or hundreds of anti-aircraft guns, firing thousands of rounds per minute. Japanese pilots approaching American carrier task forces in 1945 faced defenses they were utterly unprepared for. Their intelligence was obsolete, based on combat conditions from 1942 and early 1943, when American anti-aircraft systems were still developing. They expected scattered defensive fire that could be evaded through aggressive maneuvering. They anticipated isolated ships vulnerable to determined attack. What they actually encountered was something else entirely: interlocking fields of fire from multiple ships, radar-directed guns tracking them before they were visible, and above all, the Bofors guns, throwing up walls of explosive shells that made approach virtually impossible. The mathematical reality was this: a single quad Bofors mount firing at full rate put 320 rounds into the air every minute. Each round contained enough explosive to fatally damage an aircraft. A single American destroyer like Laffey had multiple Bofors mounts plus additional anti-aircraft weapons. A carrier task force had dozens of ships, hundreds of guns, all firing simultaneously. The volume of fire was so intense that pilots described flying through it as impossible, like trying to walk through a waterfall. Yet they tried. Because they had been ordered to. Because they believed. Because by April 1945, Japan had committed to Operation Kikusui, and there was no turning back. On April 6th, the first major Kikusui attack, Japan launched 391 Navy planes and 133 Army planes. 215 Navy planes and 82 Army planes were kamikazes. They dove toward the American fleet off Okinawa in waves, seeking targets, accepting death as inevitable, hoping only that their sacrifice would count for something. The Americans were waiting. The Bofors guns were loaded. The crews were at their stations. And when the Japanese pilots finally saw what they were flying into, when they understood the reality of American anti-aircraft defense, it was far too late to turn back. Ensign Kiyoshi Ogawa was 22 years old. He had been born on October 23, 1922, in Gunma Prefecture, north of Tokyo. He had attended Waseda University, one of Japan's most prestigious institutions, studying alongside other young men who would never complete their educations. In the summer of 1944, he had been drafted under special wartime conscription laws targeting university students. The military called them Gakuto student soldiers. His training had been abbreviated. He graduated from Naval Aviation Reserve student flight training in February 1945, with fewer than 150 hours of total flying time. This was barely enough to take off and land safely, let alone engage in combat maneuvering. Standard pre-war training for Japanese naval aviators had required 700 hours minimum. Ogawa had less than 1/4 of that experience when he was commissioned as an ensign and assigned to the 306th Fighter Squadron of the 721st Naval Air Group. The 721st operated from Kanoya Naval Air Base on Kyushu, flying defensive missions against American bombing raids. Records do not document Ogawa's participation in any combat engagements during this period. By early 1945, Japanese aviation units experienced such rapid attrition that individual combat records often went unrecorded. Pilots flew, died, and were replaced so quickly that paperwork became an afterthought. Sometime in late April or early May, Ogawa volunteered for the Special Attack Force. The process was formalized through surveys distributed to officer candidates. The form presented 3 choices. Do you desire earnestly, wish, or do not wish to participate in kamikaze attacks? Officers could also leave the form blank. The military leadership knew that university graduates, exposed to broader ideas and less indoctrinated than career military personnel, might resist volunteering. Social pressure, however, made refusal nearly impossible. Many circled desire earnestly, not from genuine enthusiasm, but from inability to bring dishonor to their families through visible cowardice. Before his final mission, Ogawa wrote a letter to his parents. It was discovered later on his body, blood-soaked but legible, along with photographs, a watch, his name tag, and a parachute harness buckle. The letter was formal and carefully composed, expressing the sentiments expected of a kamikaze pilot while revealing, in subtle undertones, his awareness of what awaited him. He wrote that he would fly with peaceful emotion through calm clouds, that he felt honored to dedicate himself to an eternal cause, that no day was more honorable than the day of his sortie. He asked his parents to remember him, told them his spirit would reside at Yasukuni Shrine, and expressed hope they would remain healthy. The letter was a performance of devotion, written by a young man educated enough to understand propaganda when he participated in creating it. On the morning of May 11th, 1945, Ogawa climbed into his Mitsubishi A 6M0 fighter at Kanoya. The aircraft had been modified to carry a 250-kilogram bomb beneath the fuselage. The Zero, once the finest carrier fighter in the world, had become by 1945 a suicide delivery vehicle for pilots who could barely fly it. Ogawa took off at approximately 6 o'clock in the morning as part of Operation Kikusui No. 6. 6 aircraft departed between 600 and 6:53 hours. Squadron leader Lieutenant Seizo Yasunori led the formation south toward Okinawa. The weather was poor. Low clouds covered southern Japan with rain forecast. The small formation stayed low, flying beneath the cloud layer to avoid American radar detection. Ensign Ogawa concentrated on following his leader. He had no skill at instrument flying, no training in navigation beyond basic visual piloting. If he lost sight of Yasunori in the clouds, he would be lost, unable to find the target or even return to base. His entire mission depended on keeping visual contact with the plane ahead. American Combat Air Patrol intercepted them. 8 F-4U Corsair fighters from Fighting Squadron 84 spotted 30 kamikazes and dove to attack, shooting down 11 before breaking off to return to their carrier. Yasunori led his diminished formation into clouds to escape further interception. Ogawa followed, terrified by the grey nothing surrounding his aircraft, but more terrified of losing his leader. They emerged from clouds southeast of Kyushu to find American carriers spread across the ocean below them, white wakes against blue water. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Anti-aircraft fire immediately surrounded them. Dark puffs of flak burst at their altitude. One plane fell away, burning, victim of either the Corsairs or the heavy guns from the fleet below. Ogawa closed formation, following Yasunori as they began their final dive. The target was USS Bunker Hill, flagship of Task Force 58, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher. Bunker Hill had been at sea in continuous combat operations for 58 consecutive days, supporting strikes at Iwo Jima, Kure Harbor, Kyushu, and Okinawa. Her crew was exhausted but experienced, her air group among the finest in the fleet. At 10:04 in the morning, Marine Captain James Sweat, flying Combat Air Patrol in his F-4U Corsair, saw the 2 Zeros diving and frantically radioed a warning. Gunners aboard Bunker Hill barely had time to respond. Yasunori released his 550-pound bomb, which smashed through the flight deck, exited through the side of the hull, and exploded just above the water. His Zero crashed into the flight deck, destroying 34 fully fueled and armed aircraft parked for the next strike, then skidded over the side. Massive fires erupted instantly. 30 seconds later, Ogawa completed his dive. Anti-aircraft fire surrounded him, tracers, shell bursts, the hammering sound of multiple gun systems firing simultaneously. He aimed for the island structure near the control tower, exactly as Kamikaze doctrine instructed. Maximum damage required hitting the ship's command center. At nearly vertical dive angle, Ogawa dropped his bomb just before impact. The bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded. Ogawa's Zero crashed into the deck near the island at approximately 10:05. The gasoline-fed fires spread through the ship. Multiple explosions followed as ammunition and fuel stores detonated. The hangar deck became an inferno. Vice Admiral Mitcher, standing on the flag bridge, barely escaped. One wing of Ogawa's Zero passed through his flag office, killing 3 officers and 11 enlisted men from his staff. The Admiral's personal physician was among the dead. His cabin was destroyed along with all personal possessions, uniforms, and papers. The attack killed 396 American sailors and airmen, wounded 264 more, and left 43 missing, never found. Bunker Hill, one of the most powerful warships in the American fleet, was knocked out of the war. She would limp to Ulithi for emergency repairs, then sail to Bremerton Navy Yard, arriving still under repair when hostilities ended in August. Ogawa had succeeded. His mission, measured by the metrics the Special Attack Force used, was a complete success. He had struck a high-value target, caused massive casualties, removed a fleet carrier from combat operations. His death had military meaning. The propaganda would write itself another heroic sacrifice by a devoted warrior of the Emperor. But the larger truth, the truth Ogawa could not have known as he dove toward Bunker Hill, was that his success changed nothing. One carrier removed from a fleet of dozens made no strategic difference. American industrial capacity would replace the losses. The invasion of Okinawa continued. The war ground forward with mechanical inevitability. The funeral for Bunker Hill's dead took place on May 12th, one day after the attack. It was one of the longest burial-at-sea ceremonies in United States Navy history. Recovery teams had spent the previous afternoon and evening searching through smoke-filled compartments, water-flooded spaces, and fire-damaged sections of the ship, often working in complete darkness, walking into bodies before seeing them. The dead were brought up and laid in neat rows on the forward section of the port hangar deck, then identified and moved to the flight deck for burial. 396 men were committed to the sea. The ceremony was brief, conducted while the ship was still on station near Okinawa, with minimal formality because time and circumstances did not permit elaborate ritual. Chaplains read prayers. Bodies wrapped in canvas slid over the side. The ocean received them. The survivors returned to their duties. Among the dead, in the twisted wreckage of his Zero in the hangar deck, was Ensign Kiyoshi Ogawa. His aircraft had not been completely destroyed. The wreckage settled, half submerged in water, with live electrical wires sparking around it. The day after the attack, Navy salvage diver Robert Schock volunteered to enter the dangerous space and examine the wreck. He found Ogawa dead in the cockpit, still strapped in, every bone in his body broken from the impact. Schock removed Ogawa's name tag, a letter, some photographs, a watch, and the buckle from his parachute harness. He kept these items, hidden, throughout the rest of his service and brought them home after the war. 56 years later, in March 2001, Schock's son discovered the items among his father's belongings after the elder Schock's death. The family traced the name tag to Takasaki, north of Tokyo, and contacted Ogawa's surviving relatives. On March 27, 2001, in San Francisco, Ogawa's grandniece Yoko Ogawa, her mother Sachiko, and Masao Kunimin, an old college friend who had spent 50 years trying to learn Ogawa's fate, received the personal effects in a ceremony that finally closed the circle of that May morning in 1945. But the story of kamikaze attacks did not end with Bunker Hill. The attacks continued throughout the Okinawa campaign because Japan had committed to the strategy and could not abandon it without admitting the entire concept was futile. The statistics accumulated: more sorties, more deaths, diminishing returns. The fundamental problem remained unchanged. American defenses were too strong, too numerous, too well coordinated for the attacks to succeed at rates necessary to affect strategic outcomes. The most intense illustration of this disparity occurred on April 16, 1945, aboard USS Laffey, a Sumner-class destroyer on radar picket duty, 30 nautical miles northwest of Okinawa. Laffey was assigned to Radar Picket Station No. 1, the northernmost and most dangerous position in the defensive screen around the invasion fleet. Destroyers on picket duty extended radar coverage to 150 nautical miles, providing early warning of incoming raids. They were also the first ships attacked, deliberately targeted by Japanese pilots, who understood that destroying the picket ships would blind the fleet. Commander Frederick Julian Beckton commanded Laffey. He was an experienced officer who had survived the sinking of the first destroyer, named Laffey, during the naval battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942. He had commanded destroyer Aaron Ward for 3 weeks in March 1943 before that ship was also sunk by Japanese aircraft. Beckton understood what his crew faced. He had drilled them relentlessly on anti-aircraft procedures, emphasizing speed, accuracy, and sustained fire under pressure. Laffey's armament reflected American industrial thinking about destroyer design. She mounted 3 twin 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose gun mounts, 2 forward and 1 aft, capable of engaging surface targets or aircraft at long range. She carried 12 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft guns in 3 quad mounts and 3 twin mounts. She mounted 11 20mm Oerlikon cannons for close-in defense. The layered defensive system provided overlapping fields of fire from maximum range down to point-blank distance. At 8:30 on the morning of April 16th, an Aichi D-3, a dive bomber, appeared on reconnaissance. Laffey's gunners opened fire. The aircraft jettisoned its bomb and fled. Minutes later, 4 more D-3As broke formation and dove toward the destroyer. Beckton maneuvered aggressively, turning to keep his maximum firepower oriented toward the threats. The 5-inch guns engaged at long range. The Bofors guns opened fire as aircraft closed to 3,000 yards. The Oerlikons joined at 1,000 yards. The first D-3A disintegrated under the combined fire, torn apart by multiple 40mm hits. The second followed, then the third. The fourth, approaching from astern, had its landing gear shot away and crashed into the ocean short of the ship. 2 Yokosuka D-4Y bombers appeared. Both were destroyed. 2 more D-3, as dove on the ship. Gunners shot down the first. The second struck Laffey's port side, destroying 20mm guns and killing 3 men before sliding off into the sea. What followed was 80 minutes of continuous attack by 22 separate aircraft. The Japanese focused everything on destroying this single ship. Beckton's crew fought with desperate intensity, shooting down 9 attacking aircraft, but the mathematics were overwhelming. Aircraft kept coming from multiple directions simultaneously. Defensive fire could not cover all approaches at once. The 9th Kamikaze struck, crashing into 40mm mounts and destroying them. The 10th hit moments later. The 11th dropped a bomb that penetrated the deck and crashed into the aft 5-inch gun mount, destroying it completely and killing everyone inside. The 12th plane's bomb jammed the rudder at 26 degrees to port, leaving Laffey steaming in a tight circle, unable to steer. More aircraft crashed into the destroyer. Fires raged. Ammunition exploded. Men died at their stations or were blown overboard. The ship's stern settled as flooded compartments filled with water. But Laffey did not sink. Her crew continued fighting with whatever weapons still functioned. Damage control parties battled fires in hellish conditions. Engineers kept the boilers running despite casualties and flooding, maintaining steam pressure that kept the ship moving. At approximately 1000 hours after the 22nd attack, Marine and Navy fighters arrived in force, drawn by the desperate situation. They engaged remaining Japanese aircraft, shooting them down before they could strike Laffey again. The battle ended. 32 American sailors were dead, 71 wounded. 6 kamikaze aircraft had crashed into the ship, 4 bombs had struck directly. Multiple near misses had caused additional damage, yet 8 guns could still fire. The engineering plant still operated. The ship remained afloat. Destroyer minesweeper Macomb took Laffey under tow. Tugs Pakana and Tawakoni helped bring her to Kerama-Reto anchorage. She would eventually sail to the United States for repairs, arriving at Tacoma, Washington, on May 24th. Laffey earned the nickname the ship that would not die. Her survival became legend. But the true lesson of her ordeal was different from what the nickname suggested. Laffey survived not through luck or divine intervention, but through American industrial design philosophy that emphasized redundancy, damage control, and crew training. The ship was built to absorb punishment. Watertight bulkheads contained flooding. Multiple power systems provided backup when primary systems failed. Trained damage control parties knew how to fight fires and shore up structural damage. And above all, the defensive armament worked exactly as designed. The Bofors guns, firing 120 rounds per minute per barrel, put up volume of fire that destroyed most attacking aircraft. The Japanese pilots who survived to reach Laffey did so because they attacked in overwhelming numbers from multiple directions simultaneously, the only tactic that could saturate the defensive system. Even then, the ship survived. For Japanese pilots attacking American ships in April and May 1945, the lesson was clear and terrible. They were flying obsolete aircraft with inadequate training against defensive systems they could not overcome. The Bofors guns were not a secret weapon. They were standard equipment. Every American warship had them. And they worked. The psychological impact on surviving kamikaze pilots who witnessed these defenses was captured in interrogation reports from prisoners taken after their aircraft were shot down or experienced mechanical failures. American intelligence officers noted consistent patterns in their responses. The pilots expressed shock at the volume and accuracy of American anti-aircraft fire. They described it as impossible to penetrate, like flying into a wall of steel. One captured pilot, whose name was withheld in declassified reports, stated that he had been told American gunfire was inaccurate and that determined pilots could break through to their targets. He discovered instead that aircraft were being destroyed at distances where he could barely see the ships. He watched planes ahead of him explode in mid-air, torn apart by shells he never saw, coming. He said the tracer fire looked like streams of light covering the sky, with no gaps, no safe paths through. Another pilot described approaching a carrier task force and seeing what appeared to be dozens of ships firing simultaneously. The sky filled with shell bursts. Aircraft in his formation began falling one, then another, then several at once. He said he realized in that moment that reaching the target was impossible, that he was going to die without achieving anything, that the whole mission was futile. His aircraft developed engine trouble before he could complete his attack. He ditched in the ocean and was rescued by an American destroyer. He told interrogators he felt relief at surviving, followed immediately by shame at that relief. The reports documented a progression from confidence to doubt to despair as pilots gained experience with American defenses. Those who flew only one mission, most kamikaze pilots flew only once. Their final flight died believing the propaganda. Those who flew preliminary reconnaissance missions, or who survived early attacks through mechanical failure or being shot down short of targets, understood the truth. The attacks were not working. The divine wind was not protecting Japan. American industrial and technological superiority was absolute. Japanese military leadership knew this. Internal communications from naval headquarters to operational commands acknowledged the low success rates. Reports documented that fewer than 20% of kamikaze missions resulted in hits or damaging near misses. The attacks were continued not because they were effective, but because no alternative existed. Japan's conventional naval and air forces had been destroyed. Kamikaze tactics represented the only means of striking back at the American fleet, however ineffectively. The decision to continue attacks despite their futility was strategic desperation disguised as spiritual conviction. Leadership hoped that American casualties would mount to politically unsustainable levels, forcing negotiation rather than invasion of the home islands. They calculated, correctly, that kamikaze attacks caused disproportionate psychological impact on American forces compared to the actual military damage inflicted. Ships that survived attacks were often removed from action for extended periods. Crews who witnessed kamikaze strikes developed combat fatigue and stress disorders at high rates. But the calculus was ultimately flawed because American industrial capacity could absorb the losses, and American political will remained firm on demanding unconditional surrender. For every ship damaged, 3 more arrived from shipyards on the West Coast. For every aircraft destroyed, factories built 10 replacements. The mathematical disparity was insurmountable. The Bofors guns symbolized this disparity in their most tangible form. Each gun was a product of industrial mass production, operating at scales Japan simply could not match. Sweden designed the weapon. Britain manufactured it by the thousands. The United States built more than 150,000 units. Commonwealth nations produced tens of thousands more. The weapon was ubiquitous, reliable, devastatingly effective. It was not a wonder weapon or a technological leap. It was good engineering executed at industrial scale and deployed universally. Japanese pilots diving toward American ships in the final months of the war faced not merely guns, but the entire productive capacity of nations whose industrial development was decades ahead of Japan's. The Bofors was simply the most visible manifestation of that capacity, the weapon they saw in their final moments as tracer fire converged on their aircraft. Behind each gun were factories, supply chains, training systems, maintenance procedures, ammunition production facilities, an entire industrial ecosystem that Japan could never replicate. The survivors understood this. In post-war interviews conducted decades after the conflict ended, former kamikaze pilots who had been selected for missions but never flew their bases overrun, their aircraft destroyed, or the war ended before their assignments described the relief they felt at survival, mixed with enduring questions about what their deaths would have accomplished. Many struggled with survivor guilt, feeling they had failed their comrades who died. Some sought meaning in the sacrifice of those who flew, arguing their devotion demonstrated Japanese spiritual strength even in defeat. But the historical record is clear. The kamikaze attacks at Okinawa sank approximately 36 American ships and damaged roughly 380 more. They killed nearly 5,000 American servicemen and wounded an additional 5,000. These were significant losses. They caused genuine suffering and left lasting scars on survivors and families, yet they did not alter strategic outcomes. Okinawa fell. The invasion fleet continued operations. American forces advanced toward Japan. The industrial disparity that doomed these attacks was never addressed in Japanese propaganda. Pilots were told they could turn the tide through spiritual devotion. They were assured that American forces were soft, that American equipment was inferior, that Japanese fighting spirit would prevail. The reality that American factories produced weapons faster than Japan could destroy them, that American industrial capacity was overwhelming, was carefully hidden because acknowledging it would undermine the entire premise of continued resistance. When Japanese pilots discovered this truth in their final moments, diving toward American ships through walls of Bofors fire, they had no time to process the implications. The psychological shock of realization lasted only seconds before tracer fire found their aircraft, and the world ended in explosions of fuel and ammunition. The lesson died with them, unshared, until survivors' testimonies decades later revealed what they had understood too late. The Americans who shot down kamikaze aircraft felt complicated emotions: relief at survival, horror at killing desperate men, satisfaction that their weapons worked, anger at the waste of young lives in futile attacks. No simple narrative captured these feelings. War is morally complex, and killing, even in self-defense, leaves psychological scars. Some gunners kept count of aircraft destroyed, marking kills on gun shields like fighter pilots marking victories on fuselages. Others refused to count, finding the practice grotesque. Some had nightmares about burning aircraft and dying pilots. Others simply filed the memories away and moved forward with their lives. There is no single way survivors process combat experiences. What united them was recognition that they had participated in something larger than individual battles. They had witnessed industrial warfare at its most elemental level, production capacity translated into military victory, material superiority deciding outcomes regardless of courage or conviction. The Bofors guns they manned were symbols of that reality, physical manifestations of the industrial gap that separated Allied and Japanese capabilities. This was the true legacy of the Kamikaze attacks and the Bofors defences that stopped them. Not merely who won or lost individual battles, but the revelation of fundamental truths about modern warfare that remain relevant today. Industrial capacity matters. Logistics matters. Sustainable production matters. Training matters. Quality equipment in adequate quantities matters. No amount of courage or sacrifice can overcome massive material disadvantages in conflicts between industrial powers. The young men who died in these attacks, American and Japanese alike, paid the price for strategic decisions made years earlier by leaders who did not have to face enemy fire themselves. The Japanese pilots who flew toward American ships carried in their hearts beliefs about divine winds and spiritual superiority that crumbled when confronted with reality. The American sailors who defended those ships carried in their hands weapons produced by an industrial system capable of equipping millions of men with reliable, effective equipment. USS Laffey sits at Patriot's Point today as testament to this history. Visitors walk her decks and see the gun mounts that fired 160 rounds per minute into the sky above Okinawa. They stand in spaces where sailors died. They imagine, imperfectly, what that April morning felt like. The ship teaches lessons without words about courage, about technology, about the costs of war, about the gap between propaganda and reality. The Bofors guns are silent now, their ammunition expended decades ago, their crews long dead or dying. But their legacy endures in every military planning document that considers production capacity, in every logistics calculation that accounts for sustainable supply chains, in every force structure debate that weighs quality against quantity. The lesson remains: in industrial warfare between modern nations, material matters. The side that can build more weapons, train more soldiers, and sustain longer operations wins, regardless of rhetoric about fighting spirit or divine providence. Japanese pilots dove on carriers in 1945, believing their sacrifice would save their nation. They met walls of 40mm Bofors fire that proved belief was not enough. This truth, learned at terrible cost, echoes across 8 decades. The weapons have changed, the technology has advanced, but the fundamental principle endures. Industrial capacity, applied systematically to warfare, determines outcomes. Everything else is detail. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.